In 518 BC, a 6-year-old girl in ancient Sparta was formally engaged to her own uncle, a man 18 years her senior. She was barely old enough to tie her sandals, yet her entire future had just been decided by powerful men, who saw her as nothing more than a political tool. This was completely normal in ancient Sparta, and it happened to one of Greece's most powerful yet forgotten queens. Her name was Gorgo, and what happened to her represents one of the most disturbing examples of how children were used as political pawns in the ancient world. Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and royal manipulation, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind famous historical figures, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. What you're about to hear is the story of how a little girl's entire life was planned out before she could even walk properly, and how she became the key to a kingdom through a marriage that was arranged when she was still losing baby teeth. Gorgo was the daughter of King Cleomenes I, one of Sparta's dual kings. The moment she was born, powerful men started planning her future. In Sparta, royal daughters were talking inheritances with pigtails. Here's how it worked. If a king died without sons, his daughter could inherit the throne, but only through marriage. Whoever married her would become king. So Gorgo wasn't only a little girl learning to walk, she was a kingdom waiting to happen, complete with training wheels. Her father made a calculated move. He engaged 6-year-old Gorgo to his half-brother Leonidas, who was about 18 years older. Uncle-niece marriages were standard practice in Spartan royal families. They wanted to keep power in the bloodline, even if it made family dinners incredibly awkward. Imagine being 6 and finding out you're going to marry your uncle someday. Most kids that age are worried about losing teeth for the tooth fairy. Gorgo was getting legally bound to Uncle Leo. That's the kind of childhood trauma that would keep modern therapists busy for decades. If you're enjoying these wild historical stories that somehow never made it into your school textbooks, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, ancient history is full of drama that makes modern soap operas look boring. To really get how messed up Gorgo's situation was, you need to understand what Sparta was like. This wasn't your typical ancient Greek city-state where people sat around debating philosophy and democracy. Sparta was basically a military machine disguised as a civilization. While places like Athens were experimenting with democracy and philosophy, Sparta was running a military state where everything, and I mean everything, was designed around creating the perfect fighting machine. This included how they handled marriages, families, and especially how they treated their royal daughters. Spartan society was built on a foundation of slavery, with a massive population of helots supporting a small warrior elite. As a royal daughter, Gorgo lived in luxury compared to most people. But she also lived with a constant awareness that their entire way of life depended on keeping thousands of enslaved people under control. The pressure on royal children was intense. They were expected to be perfect representatives of Spartan values. Spartan women, especially royal ones, were supposed to be physically strong, mentally tough, and completely devoted to producing the next generation of warriors. No pressure or anything. Now here's where Spartan culture gets really twisted. They had this practice called engesis, where parents could promise their daughters in marriage while the girls were still children. The actual wedding wouldn't happen until the girl reached puberty, usually around 18, but the legal contract was binding from childhood. For little Gorgo, this meant that while other kids were learning to walk properly, she was already legally spoken for. And guess who her father picked as her future husband? Her own uncle, Leonidas, who happened to be Cleomenes' half-brother and another potential heir to the Spartan throne. For 12 years, Gorgo lived knowing her future was locked in. She couldn't form normal friendships with boys her age because everyone knew she belonged to someone else. Other families kept their distance because she was already claimed. It was like wearing a "reserved for Uncle Leonidas" sign around her neck. Meanwhile, Leonidas was stuck too. He couldn't marry anyone else because he was promised to a child. He had to wait over a decade for his bride to grow up. And let's talk about Leonidas for a minute. He was a member of the Agiad royal house, a trained warrior, and a political player who understood exactly what marrying Gorgo would mean for his career. This was a business transaction disguised as a family arrangement. Spartan girls, even royal ones, went through their own version of military training. They learned athletics, dancing, music, and basic combat skills. The idea was that strong mothers would produce strong warrior sons. So while Gorgo was technically engaged, she was also learning to run, fight, and think strategically. But here's the thing that would mess with any kid's head. She knew that no matter how strong or smart or talented she became, her ultimate destiny was to be handed over to a man who was already in his 20s when she was born. Leonidas was about 12 years older than Gorgo, which meant he was practically an adult when she was still a toddler. For Gorgo, this meant that even as a child, she was being groomed not just to be a wife, but to be a queen who could handle the brutal realities of ruling a military state. She learned politics, strategy, and how to manage people. But she also learned that her personal desires and feelings were completely irrelevant to her role in society. As Gorgo entered her teenage years, the political situation in Greece was getting more dangerous. The Persian Empire was expanding westward, and had already conquered many Greek cities. Everyone knew that a massive confrontation was coming, and Sparta was going to be right in the middle of it. This meant that Gorgo's marriage was about military alliances and political stability during wartime. Leonidas was emerging as a key military leader, and his marriage to the royal heiress would legitimize his eventual claim to the throne. During this waiting period, Gorgo would have watched other girls her age get married and start families, while she remained in this weird limbo state of being engaged but not married. She was too important to marry someone else, but still too young to fulfill her destiny as Leonidas' wife and queen. Around 490 BC, when Gorgo finally reached 18, the waiting game ended. She married Leonidas in what was probably a fairly simple ceremony by royal standards, since Spartans generally preferred practical arrangements over elaborate celebrations. No massive wedding budget here, just a quick "I do" and get back to preparing for war. But here's what's really wild about this marriage. It wasn't just two people getting married. When Gorgo married Leonidas, she essentially transferred her inheritance rights to him, making him the legitimate heir to her father's throne. Basically, she was a very expensive wedding gift that came with a kingdom. The marriage also meant that Leonidas could finally claim his position as one of Sparta's dual kings. Sparta had a unique system with two royal houses providing kings simultaneously, and marrying Gorgo gave Leonidas the bloodline credentials he needed to rule. After 12 years of waiting, Gorgo was finally queen of Sparta, but she barely knew her husband. Their entire relationship had been a business arrangement managed by other people. Most couples have awkward first dates. These two had an awkward first marriage. And just when she might have been settling into her new role, and maybe even developing some kind of relationship with her husband, history had other plans. Because apparently, the universe has terrible timing. Just a few years after Gorgo's marriage, the Persian invasion everyone had been dreading finally arrived. King Xerxes brought a massive army to conquer Greece, and the Greek city-states had to decide whether to fight or surrender. Leonidas was chosen to lead a small force of Spartans to delay the Persian army at Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass that was strategically crucial for defending southern Greece. This is the battle that made him famous. The last stand of the 300 Spartans that's been turned into movies, books, and legends. Gorgo knew, just like everyone else, that Leonidas wasn't coming back. The last conversation she ever had with her husband was basically a goodbye. And after all those years of having her life planned out for her, she was about to become a widow before she'd even had a chance to figure out what kind of marriage they might have had. The Battle of Thermopylae lasted 3 days, and ended exactly as everyone expected, with the complete destruction of the Spartan force and the death of King Leonidas. Gorgo went from being a new bride to a war widow in the span of a few months. So here's Gorgo, around 20 years old, widowed after a marriage that lasted barely long enough to qualify as a marriage. And suddenly, she's dealing with a completely different set of problems. At 20, Gorgo was a queen without a king in a society that didn't know what to do with independent women, even royal ones. Power in Sparta flowed through male warriors, and suddenly she was outside that system. It was like being the CEO of a company that forgot to give you login credentials. Historical records from this period are frustrating because male historians weren't interested in documenting widowed queens. Apparently, women only became historically interesting when they were attached to famous dead husbands. What we do know is that Gorgo was considered unusually intelligent and politically savvy. She probably spent her widowhood involved in the political and military decisions that shaped Sparta's response to the ongoing Persian Wars. She'd spent her childhood watching court politics, learning strategy, and understanding how Sparta's ruling families operated. After Leonidas died, those skills became her survival tools. Turns out, all that royal training was actually useful for something other than looking pretty at state dinners. One of the most frustrating things about Gorgo's story is how completely overshadowed she is by her husband's legend. Leonidas became the ultimate symbol of heroic sacrifice and military courage. But Gorgo's story of survival and political intelligence gets barely a footnote in most historical accounts. The really sad part is that we'll never know what kind of leader Gorgo might have been if she'd been born in a different time or place. She had all the intelligence and training of a ruler, but she lived in a society that channeled women's talents exclusively through their relationships to men. Gorgo's story is ultimately about the human cost of treating children as political commodities. She never got to choose her own path, never got to discover what she might have wanted out of life, never got to experience childhood without the weight of adult responsibilities and expectations. The practice of childhood betrothal was common throughout the ancient world, but it was particularly brutal in societies like Sparta, where military and political considerations always trumped personal happiness. Girls like Gorgo were valuable not for who they were, but for what they represented. The 12 years between her betrothal and marriage were 12 years of psychological preparation for a life that wasn't really her own. She spent her entire childhood and adolescence knowing that her future was already decided, that her desires and preferences were irrelevant to the larger political game being played around her. And when she finally got the chance to step into the role she'd been prepared for, it lasted barely long enough to matter before war took it away from her. Gorgo's story might seem like ancient history, but the dynamics she experienced are still playing out in various forms around the world today. The idea that children, especially girls, exist primarily to serve adult political and economic interests hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. Child marriage still affects millions of girls worldwide, often justified by economic necessity, cultural tradition, or political alliances between families. The specific details might be different from ancient Sparta, but the basic pattern of sacrificing children's autonomy for adult interests remains depressingly familiar. Gorgo's intelligence and political awareness also remind us that historical women were often working within severely constrained systems, using whatever tools and opportunities they had to influence their circumstances. Spartan women generally had more legal rights and social freedoms than women in other Greek city-states. But even within that relatively progressive context, their lives were still fundamentally controlled by male relatives and political considerations. When we look back at ancient civilizations like Sparta, it's easy to get caught up in the dramatic battles, the political intrigue, and the larger-than-life personalities. But stories like Gorgo's remind us that behind every political alliance, every military campaign, and every royal marriage, there were real people whose lives were shaped and often damaged by forces completely beyond their control. The ancient world operated on principles that seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Children as political bargaining chips, marriage as military alliance, and individual happiness as completely irrelevant to larger social and political goals. But they played out in the real lives of real people who had feelings, dreams, and desires just like anyone else. Gorgo spent her entire life serving purposes that other people had defined for her. She was betrothed to secure political alliances, married to legitimize royal bloodlines, and widowed to provide a legendary example of sacrifice and courage. But what did she want? What were her dreams? What kind of life might she have chosen if she'd had the freedom to choose? We'll never know, because the people who controlled her life were never interested in those questions. Modern historians have started paying more attention to figures like Gorgo, recognizing that understanding the experiences of women, children, and other marginalized groups is essential for getting a complete picture of how ancient societies actually functioned. But there's still so much we don't know, and so many stories that have been lost forever. Gorgo's story forces us to look beyond the heroic myths and political achievements to see the real human cost of ancient political systems. She paid the price for Spartan military success, Greek resistance to Persian invasion, and the political stability that allowed her society to produce the warriors and leaders we still remember today. The forgotten Queen of Sparta deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to her husband's legend, but as a person in her own right. Someone who survived a system designed to use her up and throw her away. Someone whose intelligence and strength were wasted by a society that couldn't imagine better ways to organize human relationships. That's a legacy worth remembering, even if the ancient historians didn't think so. Gorgo lived through one of history's most famous military campaigns, but her real battle was much quieter and longer. The fight to maintain some sense of self in a world determined to define her only through other people's needs. She lost that battle, but her story survives as a reminder that the grand narratives of history always came at a human cost that too often gets forgotten.